We break tonight with a historic crisis that has brought the British monarchy to its knees. A massive, unprecedented leak of highly classified state documents has just exposed a multi-million-pound secret financial pact between King Charles III and the British government. This is not just another royal tabloid rumor or a piece of fleeting palace gossip. It is a definitive legal and economic bombshell that is tearing through the very foundations of the British establishment. The leaked files prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that while ordinary citizens across the United Kingdom are struggling through the worst economic crisis in modern memory, the royal family was secretly maneuvering behind closed doors to hoard double their usual taxpayer funding. Within minutes of these classified spreadsheets and confidential correspondence hitting the internet, millions of furious citizens took to the streets, flooding the avenues of central London and surrounding Buckingham Palace in a nationwide uprising that threatens to permanently dismantle the British royal family once and for all. To understand why the nation has erupted into what many are calling the greatest constitutional revolt in over 3 centuries, we have to look directly at the financial mechanism at the heart of this scandal, known formally as the sovereign grant. For decades, the public has been told a very specific, polished story about how the royal family is financed. The official narrative claims that the monarchy is essentially self-sufficient, funded through an ancient and mutually beneficial agreement between the reigning sovereign and the government. Under this legal framework, the monarch surrenders the vast revenues of the Crown Estate, a colossal property empire that includes prime central London real estate, expansive agricultural lands, and virtually the entire seabed surrounding the British coastline. In return for handing these commercial profits over to the government treasury, the treasury pays back a fixed percentage every single year to the royal household. This payment is the sovereign grant, and it is explicitly intended to fund official royal duties, the upkeep of historic state-owned palaces, royal staffing, and international diplomatic tours. However, the reality behind this arrangement is far more controversial than the official brochures would have the world believe. The money paid out through the sovereign grant is, by every legal and economic definition, public money that belongs to the British taxpayer. Every single pound funneled into royal bank accounts represents revenue that could otherwise be allocated to the National Health Service, decaying public school, public transportation, or national debt relief. When the percentage paid to the palace increases, it directly reduces the public treasury's available funds, meaning that every gold-trimmed state carriage, every private helicopter flight, and every crystal chandelier maintained inside a royal residence is ultimately subsidized by ordinary working-class citizens. For generations, the British public accepted this uneasy compromise under the assumption of absolute transparency and the promise that the royal family was living within modest, strictly monitored limits. But the documents that were just leaked have shattered that compromise into 1,000 pieces, exposing a financial reality that is nothing short of breathtaking in its audacity. The sudden turmoil and catastrophic protests gripping the United Kingdom today were triggered by the timing and the sheer scale of the deception. Great Britain is currently paralyzed by an unforgiving cost of living crisis. Working families are skipping meals to feed their children. Elderly pensioners are sitting in freezing homes because they cannot afford the astronomical cost of natural gas and electricity, and basic groceries have become luxury items for millions. Public sector workers, from emergency room nurses to train drivers and primary school teachers, have spent months on picket lines pleading for modest wage increases just to keep pace with runaway inflation. Yet precisely while the government was telling the public that the national coffers were empty and that severe fiscal discipline was required from every citizen, an investigative media outlet obtained and published hundreds of pages of encrypted Treasury communications. These documents reveal that behind closed doors, senior government officials and palace representatives quietly executed a secret agreement to virtually double the royal family's sovereign grant payout. While ordinary taxpayers were hit with stealth taxes and public spending cuts, the palace was granted an extraordinary financial windfall amounting to tens of millions of extra pounds, hidden away in obscure line items deep within the national budget. The moment these leaked files surfaced, the dam of public patience broke completely. The revelation was not just seen as financial mismanagement, it was viewed as an act of profound betrayal. Almost overnight, spontaneous demonstrations transformed into an uncontrollable mass movement. Millions of people have poured into central London, converging on Westminster, Downing Street, and the Mall. The grand iron gates of Buckingham Palace, long a symbol of imperial dignity and national pride, are now surrounded by an ocean of protesters demanding an immediate end to royal subsidy. Placards bearing slogans like "Stop living lavishly on our taxes" and "Abolish the grant" stretch as far as the eye can see. Demonstrators have staged massive sit-ins outside government ministries, and the echoes of anti-monarchy chants can be heard echoing through the corridors of power. Similar demonstrations have erupted across Manchester, Birmingham, Edinburgh, and Cardiff, uniting a deeply divided nation in a single, unified wave of outrage against institutional greed. At the very center of this brewing storm sits King Charles III. The leaked documents paint a devastating picture of the newly crowned king, portraying a monarch whose private demands stand in stark contradiction to his carefully cultivated public image. For years, Charles presented himself as a modern, environmentally conscious leader who favored a slimmed-down, cost-effective monarchy that would place less of a burden on the British public. But the leaked treasury ledgers tell a completely different story. The records demonstrate that Charles personally and repeatedly pressured government ministers for emergency injections of capital to finance multi-million-pound renovations on exclusive private wings of both Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace. These were not emergency structural repairs to protect public heritage sites. These were lavish, custom-designed modernization projects for royal living quarters that are entirely closed off to the tax-paying public. Leaked correspondence indicates that King Charles insisted on specialized interior redesigns, private garden overhauls, and bespoke architectural restorations using rare materials, demanding that the costs be quietly absorbed by the taxpayer-funded sovereign grant rather than his own immense private fortune. Even more damning are internal memos showing that palace officials warned the king that these expenditures would cause immense public backlash if discovered. Yet the requests were pushed through the treasury anyway with executive approval. This blatant misuse of state resources is widely being condemned as Charles's fatal blunder. By prioritizing personal architectural indulgences and opulent lifestyle upgrades, while millions of his subjects were being pushed into poverty, the king has dealt a catastrophic blow to the moral authority of the crown. The social contract between the monarch and the British people relies on the perception of duty, service, and shared sacrifice. By acting as though public funds were his personal royal allowance, Charles has alienated the very population whose goodwill keeps the institution alive. The myth of a benevolent, selfless monarchy has been stripped away, leaving behind a bitter public realization that royal privilege continues to operate at the direct expense of the working class. As the crisis widens, the scandal is rapidly engulfing the next generation of royalty, bringing Prince William directly into the crosshairs of public fury. For years, Prince William and his wife Catherine have enjoyed widespread popularity, consistently portrayed by the media as the grounded, relatable future of the royal house. However, the leak has cast an unforgiving spotlight on William's staggering private wealth and the controversial mechanics of the Duchy of Cornwall. The Duchy of Cornwall is a massive hereditary estate consisting of over 130,000 acres of prime land, residential developments, commercial properties, and financial assets spread across 23 counties in England and Wales. When Charles ascended the throne, William automatically inherited this vast real estate empire, which generates tens of millions of pounds in net annual income. What has ignited public fury is the realization that Prince William pockets this astronomical private fortune virtually tax-free, claiming legal exemptions that are unavailable to any standard business or private citizen in the country. Protesters and financial analysts are now asking an unavoidable and devastating question. If the heir to the throne personally collects more than £20 million every single year from an untouchable private estate, why are British taxpayers still forced to pay millions out of the sovereign grant for his family's private travel, palace apartments, administrative staff, and round-the-clock state security? The leaked records show that despite accumulating this vast personal fortune, William's household routinely charged state-funded accounts for extravagant travel and personal logistical expenses that could easily have been covered out of his own pocket. The public's anger has been further magnified by Prince William's total and resounding silence since the documents were published. Rather than addressing the growing national unrest or offering to surrender his duchy profits to assist struggling public services, the Prince of Wales has retreated behind palace walls, issuing no statements and offering no accountability. This calculated silence silence has backfired spectacularly. To the millions of people protesting in the streets, William's refusal to speak is seen as arrogance and complicity, proving that the younger generation of royals is just as dependent on taxpayer exploitation as the elders who preceded them. The shockwaves from the leak did not stop with the king and the heir. The exposed documents also revealed widespread financial misconduct involving the king's younger brother, Prince Edward, and his wife Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. For years, Edward and Sophie have operated on the periphery of the royal spotlight, marketed to the public as dependable, low-drama working royals who quietly carry out public engagements on behalf of the nation. But the newly exposed financial ledgers expose a pattern of systematic financial abuse that has sent shockwaves through the country. According to the leaked accounting records, Prince Edward repeatedly billed the sovereign grant for lavish overseas travel, private luxury resort accommodations, and charter flights that were explicitly categorized as official royal tours, but were in fact private family vacations and personal business networking trips. The documents reveal an internal system where private excursions to five-star destinations across Europe and the Caribbean were retroactively given an official royal veneer by scheduling a single brief 10-minute meeting with a local dignitary, thereby allowing the entire multi-thousand-pound invoice to be passed directly to the British taxpayer. The exposure of Edward and Sophie's financial ledgers has blown apart the royal household's defense that the sovereign grant is strictly audited and carefully managed. It has exposed an internal culture where family members treated state coffers as an unlimited expense account for personal indulgence. The revelation that the public was paying for private luxury holidays under the guise of official state duty has poured fuel onto the fire, turning what was already a massive protest into an explosive nationwide revolt against institutional corruption. As the fury over Prince Edward and Sophie's misuse of public funds tore through the headlines, the crisis inside the royal household transformed from a manageable public relations disaster into a catastrophic institutional emergency. For decades, the monarchy relied on a carefully curated strategy of deflection and silence, assuming that the British public's traditional deference to the crown would eventually quell any passing storm. But this time, the anger was not fading. It was multiplying by the hour. Across the country, town halls held emergency meetings, trade unions passed formal resolutions demanding an immediate freeze on all royal allocations, and civil unrest spread far beyond the streets of London into major cities across Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The entire apparatus of royal public relations had collapsed, leaving the palace isolated behind heavy police barricades as the nation demanded answers that no prepared statement could provide. In a desperate bid to regain control of the narrative and stem the bleeding of public support, the royal household turned to the one figure who had long enjoyed the highest approval ratings among the British public, Princess Anne. Known for decades as the hardest-working royal, the Princess Royal had built a formidable reputation as a no-nonsense, pragmatic figure who completed hundreds of official public engagements every year without the overt glamour or theatrical extravagance of her sibling. If anyone possessed the credibility to face the public and defend the continuation of the sovereign grant, it was Anne. Stepping directly into the national spotlight during a primetime television broadcast, Princess Anne delivered an uncompromising, fierce defense of the royal funding model. She looked directly into the camera and warned the British public that dismantling or slashing the sovereign grant would have catastrophic consequences for the entire nation. In her address, Anne argued that the sovereign grant is not a personal luxury fund, but the lifeblood of a multi-billion-pound global tourism industry that brings vital international commerce to British businesses, hotels, and restaurants. She insisted that without state-funded maintenance, hundreds of irreplaceable historic buildings, ancient monuments, and state treasures that form the backbone of British national identity would inevitably decay into ruin. According to Anne, the money paid to the royal family is a modest and necessary investment that preserves the unbroken continuity of British heritage, protects the country's international standing, and delivers economic returns that far outweigh its annual cost to the Treasury. Instead of calming the waters, Princess Anne's high-stakes intervention backfired with devastating speed and intensity. Rather than viewing her words as a voice of reason, an enraged public interpreted her arguments as breathtakingly arrogant and fundamentally out of touch with the harsh economic realities facing working-class citizens. Within minutes of the broadcast concluding, independent economists, financial journalists, and civic leaders supporters took to the airwaves and social media to systematically dismantle her claims. Analysts pointed out that Britain's tourism appeal is overwhelmingly driven by the nation's history, museums, and architectural landmarks, not by the private subsidization of a living monarch's personal household. Protesters cited the undeniable example of the Palace of Versailles in France, which attracts millions more paying international tourists every single year than Buckingham Palace, despite the French monarchy having been abolished over 2 centuries ago. The public narrative shifted swiftly from irritation to outright defiance. Working-class families, struggling to put food on their tables while paying record-high utility bills, pushed back aggressively against the notion that their hard-earned wages should be confiscated to protect the private estates of hereditary billionaires under the guise of national heritage. On the streets outside the palace, the response to Anne's speech was visceral and immediate. Crowds that had already numbered in the hundreds of thousands swelled into the millions. Demonstrators hoisted handmade signs displaying official statistics on child poverty alongside photos of Anne's televised speech, reading, "Heritage does not feed our children," and "The era of robbing the working class to protect your palaces is officially over." Anne's rigid aristocratic demeanor and refusal to acknowledge the deep economic suffering of ordinary citizens served only to pour gasoline on an already raging inferno. The last reservoir of royal goodwill had been exhausted, and the public became more resolute than ever in their demand for total financial accountability. With the streets becoming increasingly volatile and the government paralyzed by continuous mass strikes and daily civil disruptions, the crisis escalated beyond the realm of public debate and entered the highest judicial arena in the United Kingdom. Recognizing that neither political rhetoric nor palace defenses could calm the nationwide rebellion, a historic coalition of civil liberties organizations, taxpayer advocacy groups, constitutional scholars, and trade unions launched unprecedented legal proceedings against both the Treasury and the Crown. The case bypassed lower appellate courts due to the existential urgency of the national emergency and landed directly on the desks of the justices of the United Kingdom's Supreme Court. Situated in the historic Middlesex Guildhall directly opposite the Houses of Parliament, the Supreme Court became the focal point of the entire nation. For days, the grand courtroom was packed to capacity with legal teams representing the monarchy, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the millions of British taxpayers demanding justice. The atmosphere was charged with historical tension as the legal battle tackled questions that had not been formally challenged since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Crown's legal defense rested on traditional arguments, claiming that the financial arrangements between the monarch and the government were protected by ancient royal prerogatives and executive privilege, meaning that the allocation of the sovereign grant was an internal state matter exempt from judicial interference or public audits. The attorneys representing the public and taxpayer coalitions presented a radical counter-argument. They argued that the Sovereign Grant Act of 2011 was a modern statutory instrument created by Parliament, not a divine right handed down through the centuries, and that any secret agreements between the monarch and ministers to alter payments without transparent parliamentary approval constituted an unlawful abuse of state power. The proceedings reached an electrifying climax when the Supreme Court delivered an extraordinary preliminary declaration that sent shockwaves through every corridor of power in Great Britain. In a scathing and historic judgment, the highest court in the land rejected the Crown's claims of executive immunity and ruled that the judiciary possessed the absolute authority to examine the legality of royal funding mechanisms. The Supreme Court stated in unequivocal terms that the sovereign grant is not an absolute birthright, a permanent hereditary entitlement, or a guaranteed payment owed to the royal family. Instead, the court defined the grant as a conditional administrative contract between the state and the Crown, fundamentally rooted in public service, legislative consent, and complete financial transparency. The justices went even further, delivering a devastating legal blow to the centuries-old secrecy surrounding royal wealth. The court ruled that if the government and the royal household cannot provide complete, unredacted accounting records proving that every single pound of the sovereign grant is spent strictly on necessary public functions rather than private luxury renovations and personal travel, the entire financial pact could be ruled null and void. The Supreme Court hinted that failure to comply with total forensic transparency would lead to the immediate legal suspension or complete termination of the sovereign grant contract, an outcome entirely unprecedented in modern British legal history. This historic judicial ruling shattered the legal armor that had shielded the royal family for centuries. By formally declaring that royal funding is a conditional agreement subject to cancellation, the Supreme Court effectively dismantled the myth that the king and his family are legally untouchable. The judgment placed the government in an impossible corner. Ministers were now legally obligated to force the royal family to open every single private ledger, offshore account, and secret trust for public inspection, or face the immediate court-ordered cancellation of the royal budget. The realization that the sovereign grant could be permanently shut down sent panic through the highest levels of the British establishment. Whitehall officials and palace courtiers scrambled into continuous emergency sessions, desperately trying to calculate what a complete cutoff of state funding would mean for the day-to-day existence of the royal institution. For generations, the monarchy had operated under the certainty that no matter how deep the economic crisis or how unpopular an individual sovereign might be, the state treasury would always ensure the survival of the crown. Now, that certainty was gone, replaced by the terrifying prospect of complete financial isolation. As news of the Supreme Court's decision spread to the millions gathered in Parliament Square and along Whitehall, the crowd erupted into thunderous cheers that could be heard inside the royal palaces miles away. The ruling was seen as a monumental victory for ordinary citizens who had spent decades watching their public services decay while the royal household expanded its wealth. The legal foundation of the modern monarchy had cracked, and the momentum on the streets became unstoppable. Protest leaders and civic organizations immediately seized on the court's words, holding mass rallies that directly cited the Supreme Court's ruling that royal funding is a conditional contract. Across London, Edinburgh, and Belfast, massive digital billboards displayed the court's warning that transparency must be total or the funds will be cut. What began as a spontaneous response to a leaked document had now evolved into a legally sanctioned, nationwide constitutional uprising. The public was no longer just asking for an apology or minor administrative adjustments. They were demanding the complete enforcement of the Supreme Court's ultimatum and the total dismantling of state-funded royal privilege. Inside the palace walls, the mood shifted from defensive arrogance to genuine dread. The leaked documents had already exposed King Charles's private multi-million-pound renovations, Prince William's tax-sheltered millions from the Duchy of Cornwall, and Prince Edward's fraudulent travel claims. Under the Supreme Court's mandate, every remaining financial secret held by the family, from hidden private investment portfolios to undisclosed commercial holdings, would have to be laid bare before a hostile and impoverished public. The palace knew that full disclosure would only ignite even greater fury, while refusing to comply would trigger the immediate legal termination of the sovereign grant. The royal family found itself caught in an inescapable trap of its own making, with every legal and public avenue closing in around them as the nation stood on the very precipice of a post-monarchy era. The immediate consequence of this legal deadlock brings the British monarchy face to face with an existential reality it has avoided for centuries: the complete and catastrophic shutdown of the sovereign grant. If the government is legally barred from issuing another payout, the colossal operational machinery that keeps the royal family functioning will grind to an immediate screeching halt. The public is beginning to realize that the monarchy is not merely a symbolic tradition, but a massive, highly expensive corporate enterprise. Without the tens of millions of pounds provided annually by the British taxpayer, the daily operations of the royal household cannot survive in their current form. The first domino to fall in a sovereign grant shutdown would be the sprawling network of royal staff. Across Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Kensington Palace, and the Palace of Holyrood House, thousands of full-time employees rely directly on state funding for their livelihood. This includes not only senior administrative advisors, press officers, and private secretaries, but also hundreds of working-class employees, including maintenance engineers, palace guards, housekeepers, chauffeurs, chefs, and groundskeepers. If the court freezes the grant, the state payroll vanishes overnight. The royal household would be forced to issue immediate mass layoffs or confront the reality of paying every single salary directly out of the king's personal bank accounts, a scenario palace accountants have fought for generations to avoid. Beyond staffing, the physical upkeep of the monarchy's grandest estates would instantly become unsustainable. Historic palaces like Buckingham Palace, with its 775 rooms and aging infrastructure, require tens of millions of pounds every single year just to maintain basic plumbing, electrical wiring, heating, and roof repairs. For decades, the royal family has passed these monumental maintenance bills directly to the taxpayer, arguing that these buildings are national treasures. But under a full contract cancellation, the royal family would be left with an impossible dilemma. Either allow these ancient estates to fall into structural decline, or open up their private hereditary wealth to foot the astronomical bill themselves. This brings the entire crisis back to the fundamental issue that ignited the riots in the first place: the immense, untouched private fortunes of King Charles III and Prince William. If the sovereign grant is dissolved, the King and the Prince of Wales will be forced to exist like ordinary private billionaires, financing their lives exclusively through the private revenues of the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall. Every private helicopter flight between royal estates, every gold-trimmed state dinner, every private security detail, and every vacation abroad will have to be paid for out of their own private pockets, without a single penny drawn from the public purse. Furthermore, the loss of the sovereign grant would inevitably destroy the legal and financial loopholes that have protected the royal family's private estates from scrutiny. The public and Parliament are already demanding that if the monarchy transitions to private funding, both the Duchy of Lancaster and the Duchy of Cornwall must immediately be stripped of their historic tax-exempt status and subjected to standard corporate and capital gains taxes. The era of hereditary billionaires operating beyond the reach of the tax collector is coming to an abrupt and unceremonious end, shattering the illusion of royal privilege forever. The shockwaves of this financial collapse are already reverberating far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom, triggering a massive international crisis across the Commonwealth. In nations where King Charles remains the official head of state, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and numerous Caribbean nations, the sovereign grant scandal has ignited fierce political debates. Civic leaders and prime ministers across the globe are pointing to the leaked documents as definitive proof that the British Crown is fundamentally compromised and economically corrupt. In several Commonwealth parliaments, emergency legislation is already being drafted to formally remove King Charles as head of state and transition toward fully independent republics. The financial scandal that began with a leaked spreadsheet in London has evolved into a global geopolitical unraveling, permanently diminishing Britain's international standing and dismantling the remnants of the old empire in real time. What we are witnessing is nothing less than the direct, irreversible glide path toward a Republic of Britain. For generations, the British public was told that the monarchy was the glue that held the United Kingdom together, providing stability, moral leadership, and national unity during times of crisis. But the exposure of secret financial pacts, private palace renovations funded by working-class taxes, and systemic financial deceit has obliterated that narrative. When an institution demands total deference and sacrifice from its people while secretly siphoning public wealth to enrich itself during a brutal cost of living crisis, it forfeits its right to rule. If the sovereign grant is formally abolished and the royal family is forced to surrender state funding, the British monarchy will lose its fundamental purpose. Palaces that were once the exclusive private domain of royalty will be reclaimed fully by the state, opened year-round to the global public as national museums, and their multi-million-pound commercial revenues redirected entirely to fund public hospitals, underfunded schools, and community infrastructure. The ancient Crown estate, with its vast property empires and lucrative coastal assets, will no longer serve as a royal bargaining chip, but will instead belong entirely and unconditionally to the British citizens who created that wealth in the first place. The turning point has arrived, and there is no going back to the way things were. The leaked files have torn open the golden curtain, revealing that the institution of royalty was never about selfless service, but about the preservation of unchecked privilege at public expense. Millions of citizens standing outside Buckingham Palace and across the nation have made their voices unmistakably clear. They are no longer asking for modest reforms or polite apologies from the Crown. They are demanding the complete and final end to state-funded royal entitlement. The battle lines have been drawn in the courts, in the halls of Parliament, and on the streets of Great Britain. The sovereign grant scandal has exposed the deepest vulnerabilities of the Crown, and the coming days will decide whether the British monarchy survives in any recognizable form, or if King Charles III will be remembered in history as the final monarch of a fallen empire. This historic scandal has completely transformed the future of Great Britain and captured the attention of the entire world. Now, the question belongs to you. Do you believe this is the justified, overdue overdue end of an obsolete feudal system that has exploited taxpayers for far too long? Or do you believe the British royal family still holds cultural and historical value that deserves to be preserved? If King Charles and Prince William refuse to open their private financial ledgers, should the British government immediately abolish the sovereign grant and declare Britain a republic? Leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments below, because this is a historic conversation that will shape the modern world. If you found this comprehensive breakdown informative, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another breaking investigative report on the critical events shaping our history. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned as this historic crisis continues to unfold.